Every morning for half a year, a small hand lifted from a cedar fence post and steadied a grown man. That's how I think of it now. I'd be riding the east line at first light, frost tinning the grass, and the saddle leather answering with that small, faithful creak, and when I topped the last rise before the cottonwoods, there she'd be, a little girl with hair the colour of straw, cut with a pocket knife, chin barely over the top board, arms straight up like a flag that meant more than most words. I'd tip my hat and keep along, because a good morning doesn't need a speech to stand. The place she waved from wasn't much. A two-room cabin tilted into the arroyo and held to the world by willpower, a stovepipe that leaned like a question mark, a pieced-together shed with sheet metal roofing that told the story of 3 different feed stores. There was no truck out front, just a wheelbarrow with one good handle, a laundry line that worked harder than any man I knew, and on the porch, 2 chairs, one grown, one child, both painted the same hopeful blue a long time ago. What little smoke drifted from that pipe on cold mornings had a quick, thin look to it, the kind that says a fire's burning more imagination than wood. Most mornings the girl smiled wide and showed me all the work her mouth had done to grow new teeth. She'd wave with her whole arm. Sometimes she'd pat the air with her palm, as if to calm me, like a young horse. I didn't pull up to chat. Men who use a lot of words around the vulnerable are often borrowing from accounts they don't intend to pay. I kept it simple. Hat. Nod. "Mornin', little ma'am," said just loud enough that my horse's ears, not the coyote's, would carry it. Once or twice I timed my chores to pass a little later, because I'd noticed patterns no one else was looking for. The cabin's woodpile never made it high as a man's waist. The porch apron had been patched with feed sacks and flour bags, the old kind with flowers on them that a careful woman would turn into aprons and pillowcases. Some mornings a towel hung from the line so stiff with frieze it stood out sideways, and there were days when the little girl's dress carried a careful neatness the rest of the yard couldn't match. Somebody in that house had standards they kept like Sunday vows, even when the world wasn't keeping its promises back. If I'm honest, the wave did as much for me as it did for her. A rancher's life will work on you like wind on a fence post. You stand, you take it, but one day you look down and a groove has been carved where there wasn't one before. I'd lost my brother to a wreck on the county road 2 winters back, and I hadn't figured out what to do with the shape that loss left. The wave carved a groove I didn't mind having. When your days are nailed together by chores, you come to value whatever arrives exactly on time and asks nothing more than your presence. Then came the morning she wasn't there. I knew it was wrong by the silence. Not the usual dawn quiet, but that hollow kind, the hold-your-breath quiet before a bad thing finishes choosing. The air was mild, sky the color of a tin cup. No smoke from the stovepipe. The towel, still frozen sideways from yesterday, had fallen and hung like a prayer half-finished. My horse, Jasper, flicked an ear toward the cottonwoods and then back to me, asking a question I'd already answered inside. I turned off the line and let Jasper pick his way down the draw toward the cabin, hooves careful in the old cow tracks that took a curve wide around the eroded bank. As I neared the yard, I called out, normal voice, not the holler a man uses when he wants to set the tone before he set his boots. "Mornin' the house." No answer. The child's chair sat crooked on the porch, a rag doll face down beside it as if it had fainted from its own threadbare troubles. The front door stood open 1 inch too wide for courtesy. I knocked with 2 knuckles and leaned, keeping both hands visible, habit born of hard counties. "Ma'am, sir, anyone need a hand?" I stepped over the threshold without entering the room like I owned it. The little front space had the sour, sweet smell of boiled coffee and old onions, a skillet black and honorable on the stove, and a tin of baking powder with the lid pounded into place. The bed was made tight enough to pass a sergeant's test. And then I saw her, the little wave girl, standing in the doorway to the back room, with a look I've only seen twice in my life. Once on a colt that had never seen its own shadow before, and once in a mirror right after my brother's funeral. Her lips were moving, but there was no sound. "Hey there," I said, low, gentle as leading a lame heifer. "It's just me, Cowboy from the Ridge." She nodded hard, as if I'd gotten an answer right on a test I hadn't known I was taking. She lifted both hands and did something with them. Quick, certain shapes in the air, like a bird turning and settling. I didn't understand. I shook my head, slow, apologetic. She tried again, touched her mouth with 2 fingers, touched her chest, then lifted her hands and flicked them outward, both at once, like showering the space with light. I still didn't follow, but I felt the worth in what she was giving me. She looked past me then, toward the back room, and I understood that language well enough. Someone back there. She took my hand without asking permission, small palm, cold as a dipped spoon, and pulled me down the narrow hallway where the roof sagged an inch lower. In the back bedroom, on a bed built more for summer than January, a woman lay flat on her back, eyes open and far away, skin the color a candle gets when it's burned too far down. She had a cloth on her forehead so dry it made the air thirsty. One arm was thrown wide, the other clenched as if she'd been grasping for something she'd forgotten the name of. The girl let go my hand and moved fast. She touched the woman's shoulder, shook her head the smallest no, then pointed to me, then to the door, then to the world beyond, all without a sound. She wasn't mute. Her breath carried a tiny hum like wind under a door, but the hum had no words in it. It hit me in a clean, almost beautiful way, like the truth does when it isn't embellished. The child could not speak the way I'd been expecting. More than that, it looked like she could not hear me either. That's why the wave had been our whole conversation for months. Her greeting wasn't just kind, it was the tool she had. I stepped to the woman and put 2 fingers on her wrist where the pulse hides when it's tired. It was there, but lazy, disinterested in the day. Her cheeks were hot. A shallow bowl on the table beside the bed held 2 pills, untouched. The label on the bottle carried letters too fuzzy to read without glasses. The window was cracked open the smallest inch you can manage with winters this dry. The curtain twitched a little with each breath of the world. "What's your name?" I asked the girl, out of habit more than expectation. She looked at my mouth, not my eyes. I saw it then. She was reading without hearing. I slowed my lips. "Name?" I tapped my chest. "Caleb." Then I pointed to her with a question in my eyebrows. She brightened and tapped her own chest twice with her fingers in a kind of rhythmic way, then traced a shape that looked like the letter L on her palm, then drew a little circle, like a ring. I tried to say what I thought I'd read in that. "Lena." Her whole face turned to joy, and she clapped. Silent, quick claps that made more sense than any thunder I could have produced. "All right, Lena," I said, hands out to show we were partners now. "I'm going for the doctor." She shook her head, hard, plain no. She grabbed my sleeve and dragged me to the kitchen, where she pointed at a yellow pad on the table. Cheap paper, a stub of pencil beside it worn to a child's dignity. On the top sheet, in careful block letters, was written, "Store 8 miles. Doctor 14 miles. Mama sleeps a long time. I can wait. Please hurry." Below it, in a different hand, slanted women's writing, the kind learned in schoolhouses that smelled of chalk. Someone had written, "Back by noon. Leave door open for air." The note had yesterday's date. I looked at Lena and nodded. I took the pad and pencil and wrote big, slow, with my tongue pressed to my teeth like I was 8 again. "I will hurry. Lock door when I go. I will come back with help." She watched my mouth with the attention of a hawk on the wire. Then she took the pencil, tapped it twice like starting a song, and wrote under my line, "Hat off when you come back so I know you." I grinned despite myself. Smart as a border collie, this one. "Deal," I said, and lifted my hat now to show her the shape of me without it. She did the biggest silent laugh you've ever seen, head back, mouth open, air shaking her small ribs, and that soundless joy was the loudest thing in the room. I left a bucket under the pump handle outside and pulled it down to prime the leather. The pump coughed once, twice, and gave up a grudging stream. I filled 2 jars and set them by the stove where a fire didn't yet know it had work to do. On the porch, I looked back and saw Lena at the bedroom doorway, hands at her chest, fingers wiggling in the air toward me, in a pattern that looked like the way sunlight shakes on water. I didn't know then that she was telling me thank you in a language it had taken her years to assemble out of thin air and stubbornness. I only knew I'd been given an order worth obeying. I swung up on Jasper with my hat in my hands and stuck it under my arm. Proof of intent. We took the cut southeast, Caillou's trot to the county road, then opened him up where the caliche runs smooth. At the doctor's place, a squat cinder block that had once been a feed house, Doc Anders was loading his bag into the pickup when I slid in under the awning. "Fevered woman," I said, breath running behind words. "Little girl alone. Cabin in the cottonwoods." He didn't waste a question. "Go. Tell her I'm on your trail." I didn't go back right then. I went instead to the store 7 miles the other way because the not smoke from that pipe had told me a different emergency. A sack of flour, dry beans, salt, coffee, 2 cans of peaches, a sack of coal, a dozen eggs if I could get them home unbroken. "Yes, sir, Mr. Peabody. Just put it on my account with the other things that make a man frown when he opens his ledger at night." I tied the coal tight to the back, the rest to the front, and leaned my weight where Jasper could carry it without complaint. When I topped the last rise again, I took off my hat before I entered the yard. From the door, Lena saw me, then saw the hat in my hand, and lifted both arms like a sunrise. Doc Anders' truck came in behind, gravel crunching a promise. He went straight to the back room. I stood on the porch with groceries under my arm and watched the little girl read my mouth as I said, "I brought some things to tide you over." She tapped my elbow and led me to the table, and we set the food down like we were placing offerings in a church that has no icons, because it has this instead: a stove, a water jar, a clean cup turned upside down to keep out the dust. From the back, Doc called out, "Pneumonia flirting with dehydration. She's tough. We'll put her on the right side of both." His voice had that steady riverbed to it that gets a man across. "You family?" he added to me. "Neighbor," I said, and realized I had just promoted myself. Lena touched my sleeve. She lifted her 2 middle fingers to her lips and then forward, a gesture I didn't yet understand, but felt deep down. Later, I would learn it meant please in the language she and her mother had built together, borrowed from books and a church lady and a man they'd met once who knew some signs, and from ingenuity born of necessity. Right then, though, it landed simply as an order. Stay. So I did. I stacked coal. I mended a loose rung on the porch step with a scrap from the shed. I set water on to boil and cracked 2 eggs into a cup and stirred them into a pan, like making a small private sun. When the doctor came out, he washed his hands in the basin and looked at me for a long beat. "You don't speak much," he said. "Good. You'll fit the need." "What's the need?" I asked, though I'd already signed my name to it with an act. He nodded toward the back. "Somebody to stand in the doorway without filling it." I did that until the light leaned west. I stayed until I saw a flicker of sleep change into the kind that heals. I saw, too, a little girl fold into the chair by her mother's bed and sleep with her hand on the blanket, palm up, as if it were still catching morning waves in the dark. And in that silence, which was louder than any cry, richer than any hymn, I understood the truth I'd ridden into. The wave had been a language all along, and on the morning it disappeared, a different sentence had been written in its place. My hat under my arm, the coal in a neat heap, the doctor's bag open on the chair, those were just the verbs to help it along. Doc Anders came each morning for 3 days, then every other day after that, with pills that left chalky half-moons on the saucer and a stethoscope that found the stubborn drum of a woman refusing to leave her child too soon. He showed me how to lean a sick body, so the lungs drain their trouble, and how to count breaths without letting your own hurry them. I set a kettle to be useful every hour. Lena learned my face with hat and without, my steps from the yard to the door, the sound my boots made against the threshold, so she could match the rhythm even if she didn't catch the melody. On the third day, while I was splitting wood a little too small because smaller pieces mean less waiting when a stove's hungry, a man in a shirt the colour of old paper rode up in a county car and got out slow. He took a nail from his pocket and a folded sheet and tacked it to the door frame with the kind of care usually reserved for wedding photos. Notice to quit in the big letters, and a lot of bristly little ones beneath. "What's the debt?" I asked, as if it were my business, which it had become. The man ran his finger down the page like a preacher finding a verse. 2 months behind on lot rent, 3 on the well fee. Owner says it's the policy. Nothing personal. "Who's the owner?" I said. "Birch Consolidated," he replied, the way a parrot says the words it's been fed. "New outfit, bought up these parcels when the old man died. I'd mended fences for the old man, hard and fair and slow to spend, which kept families on their ankles instead of their knees. Birch, I knew, wore cologne that smelled like boardrooms and said neighbour as if it were a word he'd learned from a map, not a table. "You'll give us time to appeal," I said, and watched the man's eyes find the bed where the mother lay and the chair where the girl had slept until I lifted her into the sun that morning. "I'm supposed to say 5 days," he offered, "but I'll come back at the end of the week." "Write 7, I said, "and tell Mr. Birch he can talk to me." He shifted like a man with a pebble in his boot. "You're not on the lease." "No," I said, "but I'm on the line between him and a bad story." He didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He penciled 7 on the notice like he was forgiving me for wanting it. After he left, I pulled the paper off the door and set it on the table because there's no sense pretending a problem doesn't exist. Lena read my lips as I explained, paper arguing and "we have time." She tapped the notice, then touched her chest with those 2 fingers again, then looked at me with a question. I made my mouth big and slow. "Your name?" She brightened and wrote it for me, block letters so straight they could carry weight. "Alina Grace Cooper." Then she underlined Grace twice, hard, like a hammer laying claim to a nail. The next 2 days were about putting small things right, so the big ones had a place to land. I took Jasper into town and came back with a stack of library cards and a woman named Mrs. Crane, who taught at the elementary and knew some American sign from a summer course she'd begged the district to fund. She brought flashcards and a lapboard and the kind of patience that comes from having been ignored professionally for 22 years. Lena took to her like a calf to a bottle. They started with milk and sleep and mother and friend. When Mrs. Crane showed her the sign for brave, Lena laughed that soundless laugh again and then made the sign 4 times fast, like clapping underwater. The day after that, Widow Martinez arrived without being asked, basket on her arm, flour on her cheek, as if she'd run to us straight from her mixing bowl. She set down tortillas, beans that had understood slow heat, and a jar of green sauce that woke the room and made the air remember chili fields. "Eat," she told me, because men forget to when they think they're holding things up. She sat on the bed and told the unconscious mother the news of the town in a voice neither loud nor soft, just the ordinary sound a life makes. "They say the water board will be meeting, comadre, and I told them I had a friend who needed mercy more than metrics." She threaded a rosary through her fingers without making the beads do work they weren't meant to do. On the 5th day, the mother opened her eyes. Not much, like a half-turn of a stubborn gate, but enough to let the light in. Lena saw it first, of course, because she had been watching for change with that total attention the hearing world rarely lends anything. She touched her mother's cheek, then squeezed her hand, then made a little circle near her own heart that I'd seen her use for home. The mother tried for a word. It came out as a breath with shape to it. "Lena. Her name is Alina," I said, pointing to the paper on the table where she'd written it big and proud. The mother's eyes found the letters. She nodded and closed her eyes again, the work of coming back being so much heavier than the work of leaving had been. Doc Anders leaned over, counted breaths with his long farmer's fingers, and said to me without looking away, "She'll live if we keep the edges from fraying." He put a bottle on the table. "And keep that notice off her mind. People don't fight fevers and landlords at the same time." "Birch will hear me," I said, because I had decided it already. That afternoon I rode into town to the new office with glass walls. A young man in a tie looked up from a screen and arranged his face into a helpful shape. "Welcome to Birch Consolidated," he said. "How may we—" "I need Mr. Birch, or what passes for him," I said. "Not a pamphlet." I waited long enough to water Jasper twice and read a whole poster about opportunity zones. Then a man came out who had paid money to look like a man who hadn't. He shook my hand harder than necessary. "Caleb Hart," he said, like posing the question. "We've heard of you. Fence man." "Neighbor," I corrected. I set the notice on his table and watched his eyes jump to the underlined parts that meant profit. "You're new to this county. There's a girl out there who waves every morning, and a mother who's choosing to breathe again because her daughter asked her to. Your notice arrived in the middle of all that." "I'm sorry to hear of their troubles," he said, "the way people talk when they intend to be polite rather than helpful. But policy, your policy is a draft," I said. "This county's policy is the final version." I leaned in just enough that he could smell cattle and pine sap, and something else he hadn't had to be near in a while. Need. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to carry the arrears as a community hardship and let me work them off in fence and posts where your new properties need lines. You're going to roll the well fee onto the county board agenda and let me argue it there with the folks who drink from the same table. And you're going to put your pen on a piece of paper that says you will not post another notice while this woman's under a doctor's orders." He smiled then, the way men do when they think they're playing chess and you're using checkers. "And if I don't," I let the pause sit long enough that he could feel it, not just hear it, "then you will be the man who evicted a recovering mother and a deaf child in a county where doors don't stay shut when they shouldn't. And every time you need a crew, you'll find folks already hired. Every time you need a vote, you'll find people who've suddenly remembered they had other plans that day. And every time you drive past the cottonwoods, you'll see a little girl at a fence post not waving at you. If you can stand that kind of silence, then I don't know this place anymore." He studied me. No, not me. The county in my voice. Then he sat back and gestured to the chair across. "You're asking me to create a precedent," he said. "I'm asking you to recognize one," I replied. "We don't starve our neighbors to feed our spreadsheets." He signed what he needed to sign, not because I scared him, I think, but because something in a man recognizes when he's being offered a way to be decent without losing face. We shook hands and he called me Caleb in the way a person does when they intend to use your first name without earning it. I didn't correct him again. Some battles you save for the pasture. When I got back to the cabin with the paper, Lena was on the porch with Mrs. Crane, practicing signs. I held the letter up like a biscuit to a hungry dog. Lena read, "No more posting for now," off my mouth, and then did a new sign I hadn't seen yet, open hand, fingers together, moving from the chin forward. Mrs. Crane stood and tapped my elbow, teacherly. "Thank you," she said, shaping the words so that Lena could take them from my lips too. I tried the sign back. Lena smiled and did it again, slower, so I'd have a chance to get it right. I did, and a warmth stood up in me like a tired man stretching after a long sit. That night, when the mother woke, I sat on the floor by the stove and pretended I was just there to mind the fire, while Mrs. Crane taught Lena safe, home, doctor, paper, neighbor, brave again for good measure, and tomorrow, a fancy little move with the thumb from the cheek to the future. Lena practiced, then went to her mother's bedside and shaped tomorrow carefully in the space above the quilt. The mother lifted one finger, shaky, and traced a tiny yes in the air. On the 7th day, the county fellow came back in his paper shirt and stood on the porch, not wanting to be the bad part of a memory. I met him there with coffee and the signed letter. He read it, nodded, and folded the notice as if it were a napkin someone had spilled on accident, not a weapon. "You make my job easier," he said. "You make mine exist," I answered. And we left it at that. After he drove off, I walked to the edge of the yard and looked up at the ridge where my fence carried, felt the sky sit clean on my shoulders, and realized I'd been learning a second language without textbooks, the grammar of showing up. It has only two tenses, here and not here. It has one pronoun, we. And in that week of thin margins and small victories, a town that had always loved the sound of its own stories learned a new trick: how to listen with its eyes. Spring lifted itself onto the porch without being asked. The cottonwoods unfurled those pale green tassels that make a man think of soft things even when he's got a post-hole digger in his hands. Lena had been the shortcut to a longer name, it turned out. Took to signs like a foal takes to running the first day it tries its legs. Mother, water, thank you, this hurts, this helps. They came home to her hands and stayed. Her mother, June Cooper, came back in slow inches, each breath another appointment kept. She did not recover into the woman she'd been before. Sickness is a thief that returns what it chooses and no more. But she stood on the porch and held a cup and laughed, real. On a day the wind was playing fair, and when she saw me, she said with care and effort, "Mr. Caleb." I had never heard my name weighed so carefully and set down with such respect. We made a life that wasn't grand enough for the newspapers and therefore was perfect. I moved my fence riding to leave me a half hour by their place each morning, sometimes just long enough to carry water and sometimes long enough to set two boards where a porch had been pretending not to need them. Mrs. Crane came every other day and brought more words for Lena's hands, words for because, almost enough, proud. The widow Martinez taught June how to coax tortillas thin again, and showed Lena how to pinch the edge of a pie just right, if you wanted it to look like company, even when you were only keeping yourself. Domingo, who had cowboyed across 3 borders and 4 decades, patched the shed door and taught me the Spanish word for neighbor, vecino, and I decided it held a melody I'd been missing. Birch Consolidated kept to its word because a man with a title had discovered that being decent pays better than folks think. I walked fence lines on 2 of their parcels and traded blisters for grace periods, and when we were square, I stayed on a month longer because leaving the job half a day after the work was done felt like shorting what we'd all learned. June filed for a widow's benefit, once she could sit at a desk without the room taking it as an insult. Turned out her husband, gone 2 years to a refinery accident upstate none of us had known about, had qualified her for just enough to make rent, and well fees looked less like cliffs and more like stairs. On Saturdays, Lena and I went to the library. The librarian, Miss Tiller, whose hair was the color of pencil shavings and who had a way of using shh like a greeting instead of a scold, ordered a set of children's books with both pictures and signs. Lena devoured them. She learned that thank you can be small and sweet and mean as much as a speech. She taught me that sorry can be signed without making a fuss of yourself. She showed me that friend is 2 crooked fingers leaning together, and I have not known a truer dictionary. In May, June opened a table in front of the cabin with a hand-painted sign that said, "Quiet Hands Bakery." She sold biscuits that tasted like apology accepted and pies that taught men patience because they were too hot to eat right away. Folks stopped not because they were hungry, but because they wanted to do business with a narrative that didn't insult them. I watched old ranchers who'd never learned to say more than yep or nope take the time to shape thank you correctly, palm moving clean from chin forward, and I watched Lena check their lips and then their hands and give them credit for trying. There were days that asked more than we had on hand. The county sent another notice, this one about well testing and fees that had crept up like weeds. We went to the board meeting, not for drama, just for honesty. June stood, shoulder against the back of a chair for strength, and said in a voice that made the room tip forward, "We pay what we owe. We ask that the bill match the water and not the ambition." A surprising number of men who looked like they only raised their hands to swear began to scratch their chins in thought. The fee got dialed back a notch. It didn't feel like victory so much as correction. Another day, a man with smooth shoes came to the table and asked if Quiet Hands had a business plan and whether we'd considered franchising. I watched June's eyes go from polite to tired, and I stepped in like you do when a horse is about to let a green rider teach it something it will regret. "We're franchised as far as this yard," I said. "Plan is bake, sell, pay the well, sleep." He left an unnecessary card. Lena stuck it on the shed with a tack and later used the back for practicing hope. 2 hands rising from your heart and opening like a promise kept. Summer taught us to notice what people mean, even when their mouths are doing other things. Teenagers in loud trucks tried to make a game of revving past the table. Lena looked up, signed loud with a grimace, and then whatever with a toss of her fingers that was pure adolescence, and June laughed so hard she had to sit down. A man wrote a check with a flourish, and left with more pie than he'd paid for, and we let him, because sometimes charity prefers to wear a hat. A woman from the school board came and asked careful questions, and left us with a pamphlet for a program that would bus Lena to a speech and sign therapists twice a week, free of cost. Sometimes government surprises you. Sometimes you surprise government by letting it do the job it was hired for. I kept riding. The fence doesn't care how your heart's doing. You hammer the staples anyway. But I stopped at that porch enough that Jasper began to turn in without me telling him. On mornings when I couldn't, when a sick cow or a busted gate grabbed me by the elbow, Lena would stand at the fence and make our sign for tomorrow in big strokes, making sure I could see it from the ridge so I wouldn't spend the day thinking I'd failed anyone. It steadied me. By fall, the cottonwoods went to coins, and the air grew serious. June's strength leveled out. She wasn't going to run races, but she no longer lost her breath to the act of pouring coffee. She noticed the holes in my shirt cuffs and mended them without making a production. I noticed that her laugh made a sound like something between a creak over rocks and a porch door closing gentle, and I counted the days by it the way I used to count them by a little girl's wave. One evening the sky turned the color of rust and stayed there while the sun considered its next move. We were on the porch, June in the grown chair, Lena in hers, me on the step because some places choose you a seat. Lena tapped my knee and signed story, like pulling a thread of words from the palm up into the air. I told her about my brother, about the day the county road took him, and how the quiet afterward had been the loudest thing I'd ever heard. I shaped sad with my hand across my face, and then I shaped proud, because both had been true. She nodded the way a child nods when the world has just confessed something it was supposed to say long ago. Then she touched her chest, heart, and drew a circle in the air that I had learned meant together. I nodded back. Together, I signed. 2 crooked fingers leaning, steady. We marked our year not by fireworks, but by small acknowledgements. A new stovepipe that didn't sway like a tree in wind. A second-hand rug that turned the bedroom from room into place. A photograph on the wall of the 3 of us at the table, June's hand on the flower, Lena's hand in the air making home, my hand in the motion for friend, because I'd practiced it in the mirror like a boy before a dance, and still couldn't get it without thinking. People kept their distance, exactly up to the point where care requires closing it, and then they stepped in, because that's the way we'd trained one another. And because life likes a test, even in a good story, late winter brought a cold snap so sudden it took the chickens mid-thought. A pipe burst in the crawl space, and for a night we became plumbers in boots and optimism. I crawled under, learned again how much earth weighs when it's on the wrong side of your chest, and patched a line that would always look like a patch and hold as if it were brand new. June handed wrenches through the lattice. Lena held the flashlight, steady, bored, competent, eating a biscuit as if flood and famine were just more vocabulary. The next day, Birch's office sent a man with the right parts and the wrong attitude, and he did the job while the widow Martinez told him without looking up from her knitting about the sort of town he'd walked into. He left saying thank you in halting sign, and I'll bet you $1 he practiced it on his steering wheel all the way back. The last Sunday of March, the church ladies set a table under the cottonwoods, not for charity, not for pity, just a table where people could write on recipe cards what they meant when they said welcome. I brought coffee and sugar, real sugar, because sometimes you don't skimp. Children ran between the tree trunks like blood through a body waking up. The sheriff's nephew played a guitar he had no business owning, and he made 3 good chords work like 8. June stood and said the only public speech I've ever heard that didn't waste a syllable. We're still here. That's the whole of it. Thank you. When it was time to go, Lena walked to the fence where I had met her without knowing I'd been met, and she lifted her hand high the way she had that first morning 600 days ago. She held it there, then lowered it and shaped our whole year in 3 signs. Thank you. Together. Home. I answered with friend, and then, because I had been practicing, I added always, a little circle near the heart, a finger drawing the promise in the air. She grinned and corrected my angle with a tap, teacher now to the old cowboy, then did it again just to make sure I could sleep that night without worrying I'd gotten it wrong. The ridge keeps on. The fence will always need looking, and life does not come to a halt just because a story arranges itself nicely for a minute in your hands. But I know this. A little girl waved at a cowboy every morning. One day he rode to her cabin and found the truth that she had been speaking to him all along in the only way that never lies. After that, we all learned to listen with what we had: hands, eyes, time. The treaty we made wasn't a paper tacked to a door. It was an agreement laid on a table every day with coffee and biscuits and work enough for anyone who came honest. Some mornings now I crest the rise and don't see Lena because she's at school 2 towns over, riding a bus paid for by people whose names I don't know and don't need to. On those days, June stands at the porch and lifts 2 fingers in the sign for tomorrow, and I answer with always, and the wind carries the agreement between us like a song that doesn't need words to be sung right. If you rode by and didn't know the story, you just see a woman and a man under cottonwoods, a cabin with a pipe that doesn't lean anymore, a table with flour on it, and a horse who knows where to stop. But if you crested the rise, and your breath caught for no good reason, maybe it would be this, the sight of a hand raised on a fence post that didn't have to do any more work than be present, and how some days that turns out to be everything.